and welcome to Mount Vernon Unitarian Church. I'm Becky Brandt, and I'll serve as your guide this morning. Whether you are new to this community or a longtime member, no matter what propelled you to set aside this time and join us in worship, know that you are welcome here. We especially welcome our visitors this morning. You're invited to stay after our virtual worship for our social hour. And if you want to be in touch with us, please send an email to info@mvuc.org. We are a community dedicated to welcoming the stranger and working for justice. In this time of increased uncertainty, when we are unable to gather in person, we gather virtually to find comfort and to recommit ourselves to the mission of supporting one another in our spiritual journeys, working for the care of the earth, and building the common good. It is good to be together. This morning, it's my great pleasure to welcome David Keegan to our pulpit. Dave Keegan is a longtime member of this church. He and his wife, Sally, started attending about 10 years ago and joined shortly thereafter. Dave holds a PhD in early Chinese history from the University of California, Berkeley. He was a Foreign Service officer in the U.S. Department of State for 30 years, specializing in China and Taiwan. He was the U.S. Deputy Chief of Mission in both Taiwan and New Zealand. For those of you who need live transcription, you can click on the button at the bottom of your screen to turn that on. Even though we are still worshiping together in the virtual world, I want to raise up the importance of staying engaged, and I invite you to take time each week to look at the emails with how you can continue to remain connected to our community and check out our Sunday services. As is our custom, please mute your microphone and turn off your cameras to allow you to move about without distracting others. At the end of the service, after the postlude, we will invite you to turn on your cameras so you can see each other and give a virtual hug and wave. Please wait till you hear the prompt to turn on your camera. I invite you now to take a deep breath and enter into our time of worship.
Our opening words come from Marilynne Robinson, author of Gilead and Other Novels. During a conversation in 2015 with President Barack Obama, Marilynne Robinson said this: "You have to assume that basically people want to do the right thing. I think you can look around society and see that basically people do the right thing. But when people begin to make these conspiracy theories and so on, that make it seem as if what is apparently good is in fact sinister, they never accept the argument that is made for a position they don't agree with, because of the idea of the sinister other. And I mean, that's bad under all circumstances. But when it's brought home, when it becomes part of our own political conversation about ourselves, I think that that really is about as dangerous a development as there could be in terms of whether we continue to be a democracy."
Please join us in singing hymn 194, Faith is a Force, from your gray hymnal or on your screen.
Inside us join our voices in the covenant found on the screen and in your heart.
Love is the teaching of this church.
The quest of truth is its daily task, and service is its prayer.
To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom.
To serve life in community, to the end that all souls shall grow in harmony.
This is our covenant with each and with all.
Welcome to the United Nations publication Storytime. Today we are going to read our new book, From My Window, Children at Home During COVID-19. Remember when we all had to stay at home to slow the spread of the virus? Many of us kept looking outside as the world was slowing down. What did you see from your window? The stories in From My Window are inspired by true events and children from Asia and Europe to North America, Latin America, and Africa. You wonder what you, a young change maker, can do during the global crisis? Join our 6 young readers telling the stories of children from around the world and get ideas on how to take action to love, learn, create, and connect.
Look, there is no one on the street. I don't go to school, and I can't go out to play with my friends. Dad, what happened to us? Dad told me that there's a new type of virus that can get people sick. It can spread through the air when we are very close to each other. That's why we wash our hands a lot and stay at home. We are not the only family who stays at home. All our neighbors up and down the street stay at home too. But I guess the good part about staying inside is that I have plenty of time to read books. I went through all my favorite books and wish so much that I could read together with my friends. I have a brilliant idea. Why not share my books together with my friends online? We can see each other on our computer screens and we can read books together.
Mom has not been home for many days, and I miss her a lot. Mom is a doctor and has been working so much because people in the hospital need her help. When she does come home, I can't hug or kiss her. We have to keep our distance, and we can all stay healthy. Even though that we're far apart, we still find a way to connect, share love and music. Every day at 7 o'clock, we all open our windows and clap and sing and express our love and our gratitude to the doctors and the nurses and many others. People are helping people just like my mom. It's a very fun time of the day. For a moment, we just laugh and sing, knowing that we're not alone. I know Mom can hear us.
Masks can protect us from the virus, but it is very sad to know that not every person in our neighborhood has access to masks. So, we started to make them ourselves. I feel good when helping out. Life is not always easy. It's important that we look out for each other and knowing that we'll ultimately get through this. From my window, I see people standing in line for groceries with all types of homemade masks. They all stand in separate circles to keep a physical distance.
I haven't seen Grandma for weeks. People say that senior citizens in our society face a higher risk of getting sick from the virus. I want to make a card for Grandma telling her how much I love her and miss her. Since I can't get close to Grandma, I wave to her from outside her home. We talk to each other from opposite sides of the window, making funny faces and laughing. It's so good to see her. I left the artwork I made for her at her front door and hope she likes it. Before leaving, I draw a flower on her window to cheer her up.
Baking is my favorite thing to do while staying in. Now I am getting really busy because my baked goods are very popular. This is what I see from my window. Families who need food or medicine will hang out a red drape from the windows so that people with good hearts know that they need help. People who can help and have something to give out put a green drape to signal that we are here to help. I put my baked goods in paper bags and leave them outside their front doors.
The world is waking up after months. My friend and I can finally go out and meet. Today is the day. After a long winter, spring always comes. Never stop believing. Together we can get through anything.
Thank you for joining us for our story time. As you could see, all the children in the book are actively learning, creating, and supporting their communities, even when life was difficult and they were restricted to their homes. We invite you to join us to keep reading and creating. By making the world around us a little better, we make a difference on the world as a whole. For more books on challenges our world is facing and what you can do to help, follow the SDG Book Club today and share with us what you see and what you do from your window.
Mount Vernon Unitarian Church continues to share the plate with committed organizations that our members have chosen. For the second half of July, we will share our plate with the South County Task Force for Human Services, which is the only organization with the mission of advocating for equitable services and community development policies in the Route 1 community. Through its newsletter and position statements, it has influenced county policy and practice. Contributions will be shared 50-50 unless otherwise directed by you. You are welcome to write a check and mail it to MVUC. You can also make payments via text or credit card. Information is found on the slide and in the chat box. During this time of music, we invite you to tenderly name in the chat box or silently the joys and sorrows that you hold within your heart.
A reading from Fairness and Freedom by David Hackett Fisher, that feeling for fairness is prominent in the land of New Zealand and evident in its speechways. New Zealanders have a large vocabulary of colorful words for various forms of fairness and unfairness. Some of these terms exist in American and British English, but many do not. More than a few were Old English folk words that appear in the English Dialect Dictionary or are identified as archaic in the Oxford English Dictionary. They continue to pass as current in New Zealand. Others were invented in New Zealand, where they have multiplied in an extraordinary way. Consider the following examples: fair go, fair do or fair do, fair buck, fair spin, fair burl, fair shake or fair shake of the dice, fair whack, fair suck of the salve or fair suck of the sauce, fair field and no favor, fair dinkum or square dinkum or straight dinkum, as well as tika, a Maori word that literally means straight and direct. New Zealanders have also many words for unfairness. Many imply that unfairness is more common in less fortunate nations that have weaker traditions of fair play. A Yankee shout is a party where the host refuses to pick up the tab and guests are forced to pay their own way. These expressions betray a belief on the part of some New Zealanders that Americans suffer a chronic condition of ethical impairment. It is a prejudice that is reciprocated by some Americans toward New Zealanders with regard to liberty and freedom.
Thank you, Becky, and thank you all for joining us this morning. I cannot tell you how much I am looking forward to the day, I hope not too distant, when we can all be together on our hill, when we can gather in the commons over coffee and snacks to discuss the ideas we have shared and learned together. I'm incredibly grateful to Kate and Tyler, to the Board of Trustees led by Lynn Millett, to the Worship Committee led by Linda Jemison and Becky Brandt, and to all the others who've kept us going through this past year. I'm also grateful to our Neighborhood Covenant group, led by Tom and Colleen Griffin, and to our Sunday morning contemplation group, who have kept MVUC a vital community for my wife, Sally, and myself over the past year. The past year. So there's the elephant in the room anytime any of us talk with friends or family. All of us have survived a year and a half of life in the COVID pandemic with varying degrees of pain and loss. For the most fortunate among us, it's been a long, slow grind, living in isolated bubbles, suffering social deprivation. For others, the grind of deprivation has been punctuated by grief and anguish. For our nation, it was a period of trial and self-doubt unequaled in our lifetimes. We've been left with nagging questions. First among them, what has been going on here, and why did it have to be this way? Each of us has reached back into our lives and listened to others for answers to these questions. Making no claim to any special authority, I would like to share with you this morning my thoughts. Perhaps they will spark a resonance with you. Perhaps they can contribute to a larger conversation we need to have. As a Foreign Service officer working in the State Department, I spent several years in Taiwan and in New Zealand, two places that handled the COVID-19 crisis with fewer deaths, many fewer disruptions, and much less social tension than the United States. I found myself looking at the COVID-19 pandemic through their eyes in order to answer for myself, why did they handle the pandemic so much better than the United States, our home, and how could we do better? For me, answering this question began back on December 31st, 2019. Sally and I were boarding a flight to Taiwan. I was leading a student delegation from the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, where I teach a class on Taiwan. We were going to watch the last week of their presidential election campaign. It was fascinating, and we got to eat some of the best Chinese food in the world. I had seen news reports that a new virus was spreading rapidly in Wuhan, China, but that seemed someplace else. I learned later that these reports had reached the Ministry of Health in Taiwan a couple of weeks earlier, and they had already sent an investigative team to Wuhan to assess the situation. Sally and I returned home on January 12th, and we have sometimes since breathed a sigh of relief, knowing that if the Taiwan elections had occurred just a few weeks later, we might have been caught there in Taiwan as it went into lockdown in response to the COVID pandemic rapidly spreading out of China. Now, Taiwan's decision to send investigators into China seems prescient to an outsider, but only common sense to a Taiwanese. Let me explain. Even though Taiwan is an island like New Zealand, which some thought might mitigate Taiwan's risk, Taiwanese remembered how in 2003, SARS, the severe acute respiratory syndrome, had started in Guangzhou City in South China. spread rapidly across South China and Southeast Asia, and then leapt across the Taiwan Strait. Suddenly, Taiwan faced a medical crisis so severe that news videos showed people leaping out of hospital windows to escape the infection raging within. The Minister of Health in 2003 was the Vice President by the time we arrived in December 2019, and he had led Taiwan over the intervening years in developing a nationwide plan for responding to just such medical emergencies. Now, Taiwan is often described with some accuracy as a Confucian society, where hierarchy, order, and conformity are social norms. Those of you who may have seen video clips of Taiwanese legislators throwing furniture at each other may suspect that the story is a little bit more complicated than that, and it is. But consider two facts that reflect the norms I'm describing. First, among developmental economists, Taiwan is famous not only for 40 years of astonishing economic growth beginning in the 1960s, the kind we now associate with China, but also for maintaining income equality throughout its dramatic industrialization without the exploding inequality that China has seen. Second, the fundamental premise of Taiwan's government is the Confucian adage that all under heaven is a public charge, or government should be for its people. In many ways, New Zealand could not be more different from Taiwan. While Taiwan's one of the most crowded places on earth, New Zealand, with 5 million people, is one of the least. While Taiwan has little arable land, New Zealand could be fairly described as an agricultural paradise. While Taiwan is barely 100 miles from China, New Zealand is over 1,500 miles from its nearest neighbor, Australia, and over 3,000 miles from its second nearest neighbor, Antarctica. While Taiwan's cultural hero is probably Confucius, a scholar and teacher who lived perhaps 2,500 years ago, New Zealand's cultural hero might be a beekeeper, a guy named Edmund Hillary, later Sir Edmund Hillary, who together with his Sherpa guide Tenzing Norgay were the first to ascend Mount Everest. Sir Ed, aside from his remarkable accomplishments, was renowned for being kind and unassuming with all he met, regardless of age or rank. I jokingly suggested to a Kiwi friend that he should be called Saint Ed instead of Sir Ed, and my friend quickly concurred. While Taiwan is perceived as a Confucian society which values conformity, New Zealand is often perceived as the home of the rugged individualist who can repair anything with a length of number 8 fence wire, which is the Kiwi equivalent of sort of duct tape. Yet Taiwan and New Zealand had characteristics in common as they faced the COVID onslaught. Although both are islands, both are both are closely linked by air to places that had far worse COVID outbreaks. Taiwan with China, New Zealand with Australia. Both were led by women, President Tsai Ing-wen in Taiwan and Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, who proved themselves both to be remarkably calm, consistent, and reassuring leaders. Both chose to be flanked by medical experts whose medical advice they heeded and to whom they publicly gave credit. But leadership, however timely, appropriate, and skillful, is not, I believe, the complete answer to Taiwan and New Zealand's success in managing COVID. And okay, I used the very loaded word answer. So let me acknowledge that almost anyone who's offered an answer for how to manage COVID has been embarrassed. Even Siddhartha Mukherjee is a renowned physician and author. He wrote an article in the New Yorker back in March entitled The COVID Conundrum. In it, he confidently explained why India had so few cases of COVID and what we could learn from that. A month later, I'm sure he was wishing he delayed the article a few more weeks so he could explain why India had so many COVID cases. So with that cold dose of reality, here are a few thoughts. In a letter to the New Yorker responding to Mukherjee's article, Michelle Guilford said that her research suggested the success in conquering COVID was due to, quote, cultural differences in the willingness to follow rules. She pointed out that, quote, in Taiwan, for example, increased self-regulation and voluntary norm abidance enabled the country to keep both infection and mortality rates low without shutting down the economy entirely. The word that leaped out at me was voluntary. People in Taiwan voluntarily abided by the norms laid out by the government, even gratefully abided by the norms laid out by the government to control the spread of the virus. Taiwan's president, Tsai Ing-wen, in her 2021 annual New Year's address, said, in Taiwan, we are relying on professional expertise, mutual trust, and social unity to combat the virus together. By following disease prevention instructions, last April 12th, Taiwan became the first country in the world to open its professional baseball season. And I'm throwing that in specifically for Linda Jemison. And although like Linda, I love baseball, and Taiwan opened its season with the stands full of fans in 2020. What I noticed in her remarks was the words mutual trust and social unity. In New Zealand, Prime Minister Ardern launched a series of fireside chats, actually diaper pail chats, since she broadcast from home while she took care of her newborn. She said that New Zealand would rely on, quote, our team of 5 million to control COVID-19. Her message was simple. Stay at home, break the chain of transmission, and you'll save lives. In another message, she said, thanks for joining me, and look after yourselves. Neither Taiwan nor New Zealand had altogether an easy time with COVID. And most recently, neither, for example, has had access to anywhere near sufficient doses of vaccine. Yet both Taiwan and New Zealand have prevailed against the pandemic because they had a deeply ingrained sense that they, as a community, would succeed or fail together. Two very capable leaders appealed to their citizens, but why did the citizens respond? The explanation lies in their ideologies and experiences. Taiwanese have all been educated with a combination of Confucian, obligation, and Western democratic reformism. The Confucian obligation, as I suggested a moment ago, is about 2,500 years old. It says that a ruler or parent can claim that title only so long as they truly care for their children or their citizens. When Chiang Kai-shek's Nationalist Party arrived in Taiwan in 1945, they sometimes brutally violated these principles, but they also did some very positive things. They came finding large plantation estates. They took them and broke them up, distributing them equitably to the families who tilled that land in one of the most remarkably successful examples of land reform anywhere. They built an economic miracle whose benefits were shared by all. And in the last decade, Taiwan's government has established a single-payer health insurance system that ordinary Taiwanese celebrate as a model of fairness and efficiency. New Zealand's story and present reality could hardly look more different on the surface, but they came out with a similar result in a society widely considered to be as individualistic as our own. David Hackett Fisher, who you heard a moment ago, offered an explanation in his book, Freedom and Fairness, A History of Two Open Societies, New Zealand and the United States. Fisher argues that the primary political or ethical value in the United States is freedom or liberty. In New Zealand, it's fairness. Both societies have both values, but they emphasize one over the other. In the United States, we glorify the maverick, a gunslinger who fought for the mistreated, and then the rebellious hero of the movie Top Gun. While one might name New Zealanders who excel as individualists, social values call for them to imitate Ed Hillary's modesty. One Kiwi political scientist even suggested that if New Zealand ever erected a companion to our American Statue of Liberty, they would call it the Statue of Equality. In practice, New Zealanders enjoy universal health insurance and no-fault car insurance. And having experienced it, it's good. So what does all this mean? Taiwanese see themselves as part of a moral web of reciprocal obligations and protections led by a parental government. Kiwis see themselves as expected to treat others fairly, even if that limits his or her freedom to some degree. That vision of community-inclined leaders and citizens in both Taiwan and New Zealand who faced the COVID-19 crisis as a group, bound or rather united by reciprocal social, political, and yes, moral obligations, seems to me the key message. They needed a leader to call them to this challenge, but they were inclined by ideology and experience to respond. So what do I conclude from all of this? What can we as Unitarians and Americans learn from the examples of Taiwan and New Zealand? Perhaps we simply sigh, shrug our shoulders and say, I wish we were like them in some ways, but we're not. As we emerge from the slow grinding life of our isolated bubbles into our renewed communities, I think we can do better. We can remember that as Unitarians, we aspire to a beloved community, echoing the words of Martin Luther King. It's worth noting that Martin Luther King, in his letter from Birmingham jail, reminded the self-consciously virtuous that it was the heroic unknowns, not the heroic leaders, who were creating the beloved community. I believe we must reimagine our beloved community so that it continues to fight for justice for the marginalized, the demeaned, and the excluded, so that at the same time it works to fight against the next crisis facing our community, whether pandemic or environmental catastrophe. To do that, we must not merely be right. We must not merely stand with the marginalized without in any way doing any less of either of those. We must embrace and find common cause with those who disagree with us fiercely. So I close with a series of questions which I freely confess I cannot answer. Can we imagine ourselves as a team of 300 million, smiling with one another in common cause despite fierce political differences? Can we imagine signing on to that team knowing that it includes Republicans, conservatives, and dare I say it, Trump supporters? If we criticize abuses of freedom like refusing masks and vaccines and denying science, how do we find a basis for a team, for a community that loves one another despite our disagreements? I do not have an easy answer, but the lesson I draw from the experiences of Taiwan and New Zealand is that we have to answer these questions to survive. Thank you.
For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. Oh, for each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. Oh, for each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. We are our grandmother's prayers, and we are our grandfather's dreamings, and we are the breath of our ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. We are mothers of courage, fathers of time, daughters of dust, and the sons of great visions. We're sisters of mercy, brothers of love, lovers of life, and the builders of nations. We're seekers of truth, keepers of faith, makers of peace, and the wisdom of ages. We are our grandmother's prayers. We are our grandfather's dreamings, and we are the breath of our ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. We are mothers of courage, fathers of time, daughters of dust, and the sons of great visions. We're sisters of mercy, brothers of love, lovers of life, and the builders of nations. We're seekers of truth and keepers of faith. We are makers of peace and the wisdom of ages. We are our grandmother's prayers. We are our grandfather's dreamings, and we are the breath of our ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. We are our grandmother's prayers, and we are our grandfather's dreamings. We are the breath of our ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. We are one. We are our grandmother's prayers, and we are our grandfather's dreamings, and we are the breath of our ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. We are mothers of courage.
Will you join me as we unite our voices to recite the words to extinguish our chalice, words known within our hearts and can be found displayed upon your screen? We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
And now our benediction. As we come to the end of this time of reflection together, I invite you to reach out to one another. We may not know what we have to do, but perhaps we can appreciate that other societies, with their internal disagreements, have found ways to accept the importance of taking action together for the common good. Working with teammates, however fierce their disagreements. May we know that the other is not sinister, that the other is our essential partner, our teammate. Thank you, and go in peace.
Amen.